upbeat yet suspenseful tone. Have you ever found yourself in a situation so desperate you thought there was no hope? Stay with me, because today we're diving into a story that's going to change how you see impossible situations. This is the story of the widow's oil, a miraculous example of faith, trust, and God's provision. Before we start, if you haven't yet, make sure to check out this channel for more incredible Bible stories that inspire and teach us every single day. Now, let's get into it. Transition scene. Bustling village with desert mountains in the background. The story begins during a time of severe hardship in Israel. Famine was rampant and poverty pressed down heavily on many families. In the middle of all this, a widow, whose name isn't mentioned in the scriptures, finds herself at her wit's end. You see, her husband, a devout prophet of God, had passed away, leaving her alone with their 2 young sons. But here's the most heartbreaking part. Her husband had debts. Those he owed were ruthless, and now they were threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves to repay what was owed. Can you imagine the anguish, the desperation, and the fear she must have felt? Cut 2, the widow crying, holding her children close. But this widow didn't accept defeat. Instead, she did something bold. She turned to Elisha, the prophet of God, for help. Elisha steps forward. He wears a flowing robe and has a look of deep wisdom. Elisha asked her a simple yet profound question. "What do you have in your house?" And she replied, "Nothing, except a small jar of olive oil." Now pause for a moment. Isn't that how we often feel in our own lives? When faced with insurmountable challenges, we think we have nothing to offer. But stay with me, because what happens next will take your breath away. Transition scene. Close up on Elisha speaking to the widow. Elisha, inspired by God, then gave the widow a set of instructions that might have sounded bizarre at the moment. He told her, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't just ask for a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each one is filled, put it to one side." Did you catch that? Elisha instructed her to take the little she had, just a small jar of olive oil, and act in faith. Cut 2, the widow and her sons collecting jars from neighbors. So the widow and her 2 sons went into action, knocking on doors, borrowing jars of all shapes and sizes. Can you imagine what must have been going through her head as she carried out this strange command? Would her neighbors mock her? Would she feel embarrassed? But she pushed through her doubt, choosing obedience over fear. Scene shifts. Inside a small, dimly lit home with a table full of jars. Once they gathered enough jars, the widow closed the door, just as Elisha instructed. She picked up her jar of oil, just a small jar, remember, and began to pour it into one of the borrowed jars. What do you think happened next? Music swells, anticipation builds. The oil didn't stop flowing. As the first jar filled to the brim, she moved to the next one, and the next. Each jar overflowed with oil, and her sons kept bringing more until every single jar in her house was full. The widow couldn't believe her eyes. This wasn't magic. It was a divine miracle, showing God's abundant provision for those who trust in Him. Cut to Elisha, looking pleased and nodding knowingly. Once all the jars were filled, the widow went back to Elisha, telling him what had happened. And Elisha instructed her, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." Scene of the widow at a marketplace, selling the jars of oil to eager buyers. With joy and relief, the widow used the proceeds to settle her debts, saving her sons from slavery. Even more, she and her children had enough left over to live comfortably for the foreseeable future. What an incredible twist to her story. But there's more to this than just oil in jars. Let's break it down. Voiceover switches from storytelling to teaching mode. First, notice how God used the little she already had. He could have miraculously made jars of oil appear out of thin air, but instead, he multiplied what was already in her possession. Isn't that a powerful lesson for us? You might feel like you have nothing valuable to offer, a small skill, limited resources, or even just enough strength to get through another day. But in God's hands, the small becomes extraordinary. Image: empty jars being filled with light. Second, let's talk about faith and obedience. The widow didn't have guarantees. She didn't know where this would lead. But she chose to trust the advice of God's prophet. She stepped out in faith, believing that God would make a way. Are there areas in your life where you're feeling called to take a step of faith? What jars are you being asked to fill, even when it doesn't make sense? Scene fades to a serene view of the sunset over a village, symbolizing peace and resolution. Finally, this story also teaches us about God's character. He is a God of abundance. He doesn't just meet our needs, He exceeds them. He turned the widow's desperation into a testimony of His goodness, not just for her family, but for her entire community to witness. Closing scene. Narrator on screen, smiling, with a caption, "God can multiply what you have." So the next time you feel like you're out of options, remember the widow's oil. Remember what God can do when you have faith, take action, and trust in His power. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let's keep spreading these truths of hope and trust in God. See you in the next episode. Music fades out with an uplifting note.